Okay, I'm Ann Herter-Rapp. I'm a sociologist on campus, and I feel quite fortunate tonight to introduce to you Annette Lareau. And I have a little bit of a bio here. I'm thrown off. I thought I'd be up at the podium and I would be able to read my little introduction from the podium, but Dr. Lareau is going to be doing this down on the floor in the trenches. So, okay. So tonight's address is part of the campus's Wealth and Poverty series, a series that is sponsored by the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service and funded in part by the Wisconsin Humanities Council. And as I mentioned, we're quite fortunate this evening to have Dr. Lareau here to extend our discussion of wealth and poverty in America. Dr. Lareau earned her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and is the Stanley I. Shear Term Professor in Social Sciences and Professor of Sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Lareau has published extensively, including the book Home Advantage, Social Class, and Parental Intervention in Elementary Education, and most recently, Social Class, How Does It Work?, a book edited with New York University sociologist Dalton Conley and published by the Russell Sage Foundation. It's Dr. Lareau's 2003 book, however, Unequal Childhoods, Class, Race, and Family Life that brought her here tonight, and has also brought widespread recognition from educators, policymakers, and the media, as well as recognition from her peers in sociology. The book received numerous awards, including 3 awards within the American Sociological Association, the William J. Good Award for Best Book in Sociology of the Family, the Culture Section's Best Book Award, and the Childhood and Youth Section's Distinguished Scholarship Award. The book was also a finalist for the C. Wright Mills Prize and received the American Educational Studies Association's Critics' Choice Award. Because of its rigorous research methods, rich exploration of family life, social class, and education, and its insightful analysis, the book is an example of the very best that sociology has to offer. Ladies and gentlemen, Annette Lareau.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight after you've had a long day of classes and work and all kinds of things. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the furthest north I've ever been in Wisconsin. I'm very excited about this. My husband asked how far it was to the Canadian border. And I didn't know, but I grew up in California, so it seems, if you're California, if it's 48 degrees, no one goes outside because it's too cold. So it's considered very brave to go to central Wisconsin in February. Like, people couldn't believe I was coming. I said, oh no, it'd be fun. So I'd like to thank Professor Greenwood and Professor Herter-Rapp for inviting me and all the many emails and making my visit possible. In doing the talk for this evening, I was a little bit in an awkward situation. Some of you may have read the book, Unequal Childhoods, and for many of you, I'm a complete stranger. And so the talk tries to straddle that line by talking about sort of the core aspects of unequal childhoods, but also having some other information that's not in the book. So, we just had this election and the inauguration of the new president. And there are many instances where Barack Obama spoke about the American dream. And most Americans believe in the American dream. They believe that through hard work and meritocracy that people can get ahead. And they believe that maybe not necessarily rags to riches, but there can be significant upward mobility for people who are willing to work hard. And schools play a crucial role in this process. These are various emblems of the American dream. It turns out there's a plant, a hosta plant, which has the name American Dream. There's an exercise bike that has its name. And there are tours. And it's often in daily life that people hear about the American dream. And it's really a peculiarly American concept. In Western Europe, people's sensibilities are very different, where there's a greater role of the state and there's less belief in upward mobility. And so this is Bill Clinton when he was president. This is his view that the American dream that we were raised on is a simple but powerful one, that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be given a chance to go as far as your God-given ability will take you. And so it stresses really that it's about ability, it's about hard work, it's about talent. And many people see school success in those terms as well. And so a full 80% of Americans reject the idea that race, gender, religion, or social class is very important for getting ahead in life. Only less than 1/5, less than 20% of Americans believe that. That race, gender, religion, or class. So rather than stressing barriers, Americans stress opportunities, and educational opportunities are at the heart of that process. Oops, I did it twice. Sorry. And in that, I talked to school teachers this morning in the Wausau district, and then in the afternoon at another district, DC Everest. And many educators stress the importance of families as really the key in getting a good outcome in education. So they value parent involvement in education. And many educators see parents who are involved as those who value education, and see parents who are not involved as not valuing education. And in my book, what I try to do is what I would say is problematize that notion. And if in America we have a language of race where people readily understand where people live at different races, people understand racial stratification, we tend not to have a language for social class. Social class is largely invisible in America. People often don't believe in social class. They don't see social class in the same way that they see race. But social class can be very important, and it can especially have an important role in schooling, children's schooling, and in parent involvement in schooling. And so it's common for educators to complain in low-income communities that parents are not sufficiently involved. They don't come to school events, they don't help with homework, they don't participate in schooling, and they see this as a lack of education or a lack of valuing of education, which I believe is incorrect. Now, there are some times where upper middle class parents can be quite demanding. There are parents who want their kids to be in the gifted program even though they don't qualify. They can ask for, quote unquote, the best teacher, and they can make many requests of schools, some of which schools can meet and some of which schools cannot meet. A teacher told me today that a mother wanted her to change her daughter's socks with her every day after recess. And the teacher was, she had a lot of kids, she didn't have time to do it, and she wanted the mother to teach the daughter to pull the snow pants over so her socks wouldn't get wet. But the mother was very focused on her own child and giving every advantage to her own child. So I think it's pretty clear that all parents want their children to be healthy and happy, but people have different ideas about how to best promote that. And by definition, in my view, people who are middle class, most of you will go on to have a college degree. Virtually all of you will have a college degree. And you could become school teachers. And if you don't become school teachers, it's because you chose not to become a school teacher. It's not because you didn't think you were smart enough or capable enough. And yet people who are working class, people who have a high school degree or some college, who are working a blue-collar job, they are correct in seeing educators as professionals. So they're looking up the ladder to educated people, people with a college degree who have something they don't have. And many of them look at teachers the way we might look at brain surgeons. So it would be unlikely if we were going to have a brain surgery, God forbid, that we would go in and try to tell the brain surgeon how to proceed and understand the procedure and get involved. But it is, but that way of looking up the ladder at brain surgeons as being professionals is really the way many working class people look at teachers. And that's a reasonable point of view. So to expect parents to be involved in schooling, to participate in schooling, is often an unreasonable point of view and presumes a set of class resources, a set of educational and informational resources that many people do not have. And so that's what I want to, in terms of the study, that's what I want to tell you about unequal childhoods, about there are many benefits to being raised working class, but the likelihood of your parents being involved in school is not one of them. So using a gardening analogy, for a while I was going to call it hothouse parenting, but that seemed a little bit too critical. So in the end, it was concerted cultivation, which nobody can remember. People read the whole book, and then they can't remember the term. So really, the term didn't work. But the argument is that middle-class parents see children as a project. They seek to develop their talents and skills. They seek to help them develop their horizons. And they reason with them. They use language skills. They organize their time use. And they intervene in institutions, which are the three things I'm going to talk about tonight: time use, language use, and intervention in institutions. And through that, they give children a sense of entitlement, a sense of information and skills that working class kids often don't have. And for working class parents and poor parents, they want their kids to be happy and healthy. They work very hard to give them scarce resources. But then they presume that children will spontaneously grow and thrive. So parents do not presume that they have a duty to sign them up for a lot of activities. They give them directives rather than reasoning with them. And rather than supervising their schooling and doctor visits, they turn over responsibility to professionals. And I call this the accomplishment of natural growth. So it's sort of like a wildflower versus cultivated flower imagery. They're both beautiful and have lots of strengths, but they're very different. So the three areas which I looked at, were there other areas of life that were very important? Sure. Food. We followed these families around, and at some point when I was writing the book, there were lots of decisions. You read a book and it looks pretty fixed, but really almost all decisions could have been written, almost all books could have been written a different way. And for a while, I thought about organizing the book by social class. I thought about organizing it around food or house furnishings or cultural practices. So there are lots of different ways, but in the end, these were the three things that I focused on in the book for white and black families. So the study was done quite a while ago. It took me a long time to write it up and to finish it. I began in a Midwestern community, which was not that unlike Wausau. It was 2 hours from a major city. It was predominantly white, though it did have a largely African-American population. And actually, that's how I ended up with this design. I was planning really only to study white families. And then there had been a boycott of the school by black families. And in this case, the schools were almost half black and half white. And in that sense, to only study white parents just didn't make any sense. If you're going to study parent involvement, you have to study the kids who are there. So that's how I ended up with a half black, half white sample. So I did these visits in the classroom, and then I did 2-hour interviews with moms and then with dads. In the end, I ended up with 88 families where we did a 2-hour interview. But I still wasn't that satisfied with the results, and I moved to a large northeastern city in 1990. I started the study again. I did some more interviews, did some more visits at 2 schools, and then I decided really to try to understand it. I was going to need to try to follow families around, and people were like, "Are you out of your cotton picking mind? No one's going to ever let you in their house and let you follow them around. Like, are you crazy?" And I'm doing a study right now where I'm going to start in the fall, and I'm going to give people a $1,000 honorarium. And I wasn't married when I did the study. I got married at 43 for the first time. And you could give my husband $500,000, and he would never agree to be in the study. You know, I would agree to be in the study, but he would never be agreed. So there were some people who just were never going to agree. But so these are the 88 families that, and so to be middle class, it's not income, it's a college degree. You have to have a college degree, and you have to have some job with some level of occupational prestige and occupational flexibility, like a lawyer or a doctor or a high-level manager or an elementary school teacher. Working class are people who are in the labor force, who have a high school degree or a high school dropout, or they might have some college, but they're working full-time. Poor people are people who are not in the labor force, who are out of the labor force. The kids were 8 to 10 years old. So then the most unusual is that we had 12 families. We followed them around. Most of the families came from the public schools, so we've been doing visits. We asked 19 to get 12. You know, considering we were asking to visit them every single day, often for 3 weeks, I was really pleased with the response rate. We did have one overnight visit in most cases. We would visit for 2 or 3 hours, and we would go home and we would write at the computer for 5 to 12 hours. And we would try to write down everything that happened. We didn't carry notepads with us, but gradually we started carrying tape recorders with us. And it's sort of like if they were used to you, you were okay. If you were okay, I mean, we could have carried cameras with us. You know, they didn't really care. We told people we were writing a book. One person went 3 or 4 times a week. I went once or twice a week, and somebody else went once or twice a week, unless I was a lead field worker, in which case I went 3 to 4 times a week. It was, I would say, pretty insane to try to do 12 families. I would not recommend it. You know, we were there on Easter Sunday. We were there on Christmas Eve. You know, we were trying to catch all the same things for the 12 kids. It was, you know, it was a lot. And I really wanted to do as much of the field work myself. You know, did we have an impact? Sure. You know, did people, we noticed that yelling went up and cursing. It was very tense when we were first there. The first few days, it was very awkward. And we would like say, oh, we're like the family dog, like, you know, don't mind us, you know. But we would sort of sit on the floor. We would sit in the back seat. We would go with kids where they do whatever they did. And, you know, people got used to us. Like if somebody followed you around in your life, you know, it might be incredibly tense and difficult for the first hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. But day in and day out, people kind of get used to you. And we noticed yelling went up and cursing went up on the 3rd day and again on the 10th day. You know, there's a lot of yelling in a lot of families. You know, like, you know, cut it out, shut up, don't do that. You know, kids are like whacking each other, you know, TV's on. You know, family life goes on, especially with little kids. And so at some level, we were sort of part of the woodwork. The kids liked the visits. They all used the same word. The word they used was the word special. It made them feel special to be in a book. I spoke, if I didn't go, I spoke with each research assistant after the visit. Especially for the black families, we always had one African-American research assistant. The kids, we would ask the kids how it was different. The kids would, you know, tell you, 8 to 10-year-olds, they would tell you the truth. They'd say, oh, my mom talked more, the house was cleaner, things like that, you know. And then 10 years after, I sent them a Christmas card with $5 tucked into the envelope, which I'll probably do for the rest of my life for most of these kids. 10 years later, I went back and I interviewed the child who was now 19 or 20. And I interviewed most of the other, I interviewed the parents. Some of the parents, I gave the book. I told the parents I would give them the book when it came out, which I would not do again. And the book hurt some of the parents' feelings. And, it's kind of like when I was telling them, oh, you're not going to like it. It's kind of like when people take a picture of you and, you think it's fine. Other people think it's fine, but you don't like it. But for some of the families were offended by how they were portrayed. And so for some of the families, it was very difficult. Other families were fine. But it was, it was difficult for some of them. Okay, so time use. Here is a pretty typical middle-class kid's schedule. This is one kid. Family has 3 kids. This does not include the mother's travel schedule or the dad's work schedule. Both the mom and the dad had high-level professional jobs, and they both had overnight travel. It's in May where things are kind of at a hectic point. The school year's ending. There's like piano recitals and school performances. Swim team's starting. Baseball is starting. But you see that it's pretty busy. And this was pretty typical for the middle-class kids. I would have given my right arm for a middle-class kid who did not have one activity. And I just couldn't find them. I asked everybody I know. And a lot of people say, oh, we hardly do anything. But then it turned out they did two things, right? They say, oh, we don't do anything. But then they had, Sunday school and maybe piano. But they said, oh, people who do ice hockey, they're crazy, right? They'd say they're like car charging around, they're going all over. The rinks are very expensive. You have to get up at 4 in the morning to practice. They say, oh no, we don't do that. So people often compared themselves to other families, but it was very common to be in these organized activities. And the kids liked their organized activities for the most part. They enjoyed it. But the people who were busiest were the parents, especially the moms. So we did what kids did. Right? So if kids hang out, we hung out. So the kids would get dressed, and then we would wait. I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, but a lot of times you're a kid, you're waiting for your parents, right? So you're just sort of hanging around waiting. And it's the mom who would be answering the phone, putting out the dog, getting the uniform for the kid to wear, getting the ice chest, getting the folding chairs, telling kids to get in the car, locking the house, and taking off. But the kids would be more or less hanging out. So the kids weren't that busy. They were tired sometimes, and a lot of them fell asleep in various things. And they seemed older than our working class kids, who were exactly the same age. And they seemed harder to impress. Like the middle class kids, if there was a pizza party, they didn't even look that excited. But for the working class kids to have a pizza party was very, very exciting. And same thing if there was a performance like here at the holidays or in the spring, the working class kids would be going like, hi, Mom, and they'd look excited, and they'd be smiling, kind of bouncing all over. Middle class kids looked bored for the most part. They didn't look like it was that special. So even though they were exactly the same age, the middle class kids seemed sort of older and more accomplished. Now, middle class kids' activities dominated family life. Parents were rushing around from here and there. And there would be this predictably unpredictable nature of activities, especially with tournaments. You never quite knew how long you were going to play before you lost. And that could create a lot of uncertainty. And so there were all these scheduling conflicts. They were always at the last minute. And here we are, like in the kitchen of somebody, the dad's saying, he has a game on the 22nd. He showed her the soccer calendar, and the mom said it wasn't scheduled, and the dad sounded upset. And he said, I know, it changed. And she said, what time is it? And he said, 4. And the mom said he could make it. He has 2 soccer games, a baseball game, a graduation party on the same day. And so this was pretty typical, and there was a lot of labor involved. Now, working class kids just had a different pace of life. They would often hang out, they would watch TV, they would play. There wasn't the same anti-TV notion as there was in the middle-class families. And kids just hung out. Like we were visiting with this family that had an 18-month-old baby, and the kid would pound on the glass table. And at the very end of the 3 weeks, we discovered all these Fisher-Price toys in the closet that they never played with. But the mom didn't see it as crucial. If you don't have a notion of kids developing their skills, it doesn't matter if you pound on the glass table, or play with Fisher-Price toys, because it's not a notion of childhood. And so here we are one time in this working class black kid's home, and we're all lying on the floor. It's during the summer. And there was sort of a coffee table here. And one kid's lying under one side, and this other kid's lying on the other side, and I'm lying on the third side. And we're all just like lying on the floor. And one of them is like this, like with his hand, sort of like, kind of like playing with his hand this way. And so Tyrek's on the floor watching cartoons. Clayton's on the couch, sprawled out, trying to convince Tyrek to go swimming in the public pool a few blocks away. Clayton is arching his fingers forward like this. Back in sequence, he looks languid. They're talking in low voices. Clayton can't hear what Tyrek is saying, so he slowly slides off the couch. So now he lies on his back on the floor in the small space between the couch and the coffee table. All three of us are lying on the floor with the parts of our bodies jutting underneath the coffee table, and it seems perfectly normal. Nobody makes jokes about it. We're all just there. So this is a pretty common, unfolding of time, just sort of passing time during the summer. Kids go outside, they ride their bikes, sometimes they go for water ice, they play with other cousins. It's just a different pace of life. Well, middle-class kids sometimes had free time. It was sandwiched between organized activities, while working-class families tend not to have that. This is a nationally representative sample for kids based on kids' time diary hours. If you look at a mom who has a BA, this is a child's hours. It's pushing 5 hours a week pretty hard. So if a mom has 2 children, then it's about a quarter-time job. It's about 10 hours a week of kids' activities. The lower the education, the less time kids spend in organized activities. There are cultural products that are developing to take care of this new development. This is mom's calendar, who does what and goes where, but not why. Right? It says, Dad, you can use it too. And each member of the household has his or her own line. And then this is a Doonesbury cartoon that appeared a couple years ago on the first day of school. And these 2 moms are talking, and this mom says, whew, what a summer we had. And Jen's theater camp was so time intensive, she showed up for swimming practice, completely exhausted. Those damn French lessons, don't get me started. So what was Sam up to this summer? Nothing. Nothing? Yep, she played out in the pond a lot, built a tree fort, basically nothing. Well, I guess technically that's not child abuse. That's what my thinking. So, now we have parents who are anxious to keep up, who don't want their children to get behind, who can be against brownies or a t-ball, and there's all this pressure to have kids' activities. But now some of the professionals, the doctors, are saying, don't overschedule kids. And so now people schedule unscheduled time. And so it's on the calendar as unscheduled time. And somebody told me that they were with some kids. They were in a park, and they overheard a mom yelling at a kid saying, Tommy, hurry up, you're going to be late for your unscheduled time. And so there's this sort of scheduling of family life. Okay. Kids' activities, for the most part, create enormous demands on labor, and I've done other research showing the work, especially for mothers. All those chairs had to be brought, right? Parents had to get there on time. If you're 7 minutes late, you're really late. There's a lot of pressure on people. Even when dads were heavily involved and quote unquote totally did the soccer, we found that mothers were likely to do the snacks, handle the rainouts, sign the kids up, and handle the uniforms. Dads would say, oh, we signed him up. And we'd say, who signed him up? And they said, his mother signed him up. So it'd be like, voila, like magic. It happens. And so even fathers who were very heavily involved often were less involved with these organized activities. There's hours and hours of work behind this picture, right? Everybody had to order the uniform. They had to all find out what day they had to be there. They had to be there at time. They had to each have their uniforms and their trophies. Then they had to order the photograph to get it and to pay for it and get it, and then they had to pick it up. Lots of hours. A lot of dads had to learn coaching, since many dads didn't do soccer as kids. Again, lots of time. And so for middle-class kids, organized activities come to dominate family life. There's a pace of, and then the key thing is that parents think that they have a duty to entertain. And so middle-class kids would complain about being bored, and they would complain to their parents, and they'd say, Mom, I'm bored, right? As if it's Mom's job to solve this problem. And in working-class kids, we just didn't find that. We didn't find people complaining about being bored, and we certainly didn't hear them turning to their parents and expecting them to explain, their parents to solve it. Working-class kids. Now, a lot of middle-class kids had very acrimonious relationships with their siblings. And kids would often also be very critical of their parents. These are little kids. And they would say, Mom, you're doing it wrong, or, oh, I hate it. I hate you. You know, they'd say this stuff. Or they would hate their siblings. And they would sometimes sit in the back of the car and spit on each other and hit each other and clobber each other in the back of the car. And a lot of the middle-class kids did this on these long car rides, or even on their way to church. And it wasn't that the parents appreciated this, but this was sort of part of the price of doing business. This is how family life worked in middle-class families. And people would say, like one time we were in this white middle-class family, and she was playing the Nutcracker, and their brother came in and started playing the piano over it, and she's like telling her mom, she said, I hate him. And the mother said, I know. Right? So there would be these open, not all families did this, but some families, this was tolerated, this sort of open expressions of hostility towards siblings. We did not find this in the working-class families, in poor families. Now, we had a small sample, but and it's not that they never had spats, which they did, but there was more a sense of being together. One of the kids sometimes would get into trouble for clobbering another kid on the playground who had said something ugly about a sibling or a cousin. And so this sort of kinship as being the orienting framework for daily life was very palpable in working-class families and poor families. Wrestling was common inside the houses. So there was more autonomy from adults, more time to explore the world, more television watching, and school was relatively unusual in their life experience. Soccer's a lot like school. Piano's a lot like school. Adults tell you what to do, you have to line up, you have to perform, you have to practice. Working class kids didn't have that same repertoire of experiences. Now, the second issue that was really crucial was about language differences. And middle-class parents talked to kids a lot. And they answered questions with questions. They reasoned with them. And they negotiated with them. And kids learned how to negotiate too. And so they often, just little things like driving down the street, kids and parents would negotiate. And so one time we were going out of church with the African-American middle-class family, and we were just on the way back from church. And Alex says that he likes the X-Men, right? So what does the father do? He starts grilling him. He says, well, which X-Man is your favorite? Why do you like that X-Men? And that, essentially, he was asking him to write a college essay, right? What was his thesis, right? He liked what X-Men the best, what was the evidence for it? And we also saw people using language to make laughter and jokes. So in the Tallinger family, we were sitting around one evening and they were having dinner, and somebody said that they had heard about Van Gogh. And, dads often especially would make these little jokes. And, whoops. Lost my quote. And the dad said something about, I bet you wasn't he the one who sent his air mail? The dad. So dads would often make these little jokes. In the middle class family, especially in the Alexander William family, here we were, and he had a homework assignment to do 5 riddles, and the dad, they essentially teach him a word that would be on the SAT over dinner. It's an African-American family. So he goes. He said, well, why don't you go upstairs to the 3rd floor and get one of those jokes and see if there's a riddle up there. Kid goes, oh, it's a good idea. I'll go upstairs and copy one. The dad turns around and says, that was a joke. That's not a valid suggestion. That's not an option. And the mom says, seeing it as a teachable moment, there's a word for that, you know, plagiarism. So this is, and the dad says, well, that's only, someone can sue you for plagiarism, right? So here, this family is just joking around after dinner, talking about plagiarism, right? And that was a very common pattern. Well, in the working class families, kids were given directives. And a lot of the working class and poor families had a limited vocabulary. So for example, there was a birthday card that one of the parents got, and it had the word heredity in it, and the mother didn't know what the word and stumbled over and couldn't read it to her little daughter. And another time we were in a doctor visit, and the doctor was telling the kid to do fractions and to figure out what his weight was, and neither the parent, the mother, nor the kid could do it. So people's language skills and literacy skills were quite limited. Most of the parents could not read the forms that came home from school. And so in working class and poor families, people gave directives. There was less talking. In the McAllister family, there were kids who shared the bathroom. The mom used one word, bathroom. She would give a kid a washcloth. She would say bathroom. Kid would get up, go take a shower. So there was simply less communication. And other people have done like Ways with Words with this book by Shirley Bryce Heath, has shown that middle class teachers are likely to see kids as conversation partners. And so these kids are pre-verbal. They're like babies, 6-month-old babies. And they can't talk. You know, sometimes they can coo and they can smile, but they can't talk. So what does the mom do? She treats it as a conversation partner. Okay, we're going to go change your diaper now. Pause. Okay, does that feel better? Pause. The baby's not going to answer, I assure you. So what middle-class parents do, especially what they do is they treat kids as conversation partners before they're even learning language. And then they constantly teach them language. Lamp, nose, hand. They ask them known information. They say, does that ice cream taste good? Like, duh, you know? But they're asking known information, which is exactly what happens in classrooms. So in working class and poor families, parents don't treat children as conversation partners. They give them directives, cut it out, shut up, don't do that. They don't talk with them in the same way, and the kids don't learn the same level of language. And then the most important difference was in intervention in institutions, where, for example, in this middle class family, here in this working class the middle class family, the mom intervened over gymnastics. And the mom says, on this first day, Stacy did, even though she was a skill, it was like turn your feet this way, turn your hands that way, and nothing was very good. And Stacy was devastated and she was crying in the car. And the mom says, I was somewhat furious. But mom didn't go marching up to her and say, my daughter is very upset. Instead, she framed it in a particular way. She went up to her and talked to her. And she said, oh, is there a problem? And the teacher said, oh, she'll be fine. She just has to work on certain things, blah, blah, blah. And I said, she's really upset. She said, you were pretty much correcting everything. And the teacher said, well, she's got to learn the terminology. And so Mrs. Marshall acknowledges that her daughter's not familiar with the terminology, but she defends her daughter in discussion. I said, look, maybe it's not all the student. You know, like sometimes teaching and learning is a two-way proposition. And sometimes teachers have to learn how to meet the needs of the kid. So her style was not accommodating to Stacy. So here, this mother is role modeling for her daughter the legitimacy of an individualized approach to instruction. She frames her opening question as a question. Is there a problem? She alerts the instructor that there's been a negative impact on her daughter. She's really upset. Her criticism is indirect, not direct. Maybe it's not the student, but she indicates that she expects her daughter to be treated differently. And we saw middle-class parents do this over and over again, that they would intervene for their children, they would gather information, and they would try to structure. So some of the middle-class parents would prep children before doctor visits as they're driving down the road and say to them, when they're in the car, when we're in the back seat, and they would say, Alexander, she would say, let me get my quote. Lost my quote here. Excuse me. Alexander, you should be thinking of questions you might want to ask the doctor. You can ask him anything you want. Don't be shy. So Alexander says, well, I might have some bumps under my arm from my deodorant. She says, really, from your new deodorant? She said, yeah. Well, she says, you should ask the doctor. So here she's role modeling for her son and helping to train her son, who's only 10 years old, that he has the right to speak up, and that she's role modeling the idea he should prepare for an encounter with a person in a position of authority by gathering his thoughts. We did not see working class parents do this. And instead, working class parents had very limited knowledge of the school, while the middle class parents referred to the teachers by name, sometimes by nickname, Mr. T or Mr. Smith. And they knew the names of the teachers in special education, in PE, in history, and in science. The working class parents virtually uniformly referred to it as the school. And the working class parents also worried about educators coming and taking their kids away. It used to be in colonial America that beating kids were considered not to be born innocent, and it was considered certainly legitimate to hit them quite severely. Even highly educated people believed in corporal punishment up through the beginning of the early part of this last century. So there's fashions in child rearing. And the latest fashion is for reasoning, not for corporal punishment. If middle-class parents abuse kids verbally and say ugly and horrible things to them, like I'm going to leave you if you do that to me one more time, nobody turns them in. But if kids walk into school with red marks from their arms, there's a risk for catastrophic outcomes that their kids could be taken away from them. So even though teachers believe themselves to be trusting and wonderful, warm and friendly and helpful people, in fact, working class people correctly see the school as a threat and correctly see the school as an arm of the state who could take kids away. And so parents don't come to school with even equal resources. Middle-class parents are complying with resources more likely than working-class and poor parents. This is a parent-teacher conference just from a stock slide. You see how anxious that mom looks? See how she's sort of leaning in? She looks a little bit anxious. Very common. And working-class parents depend on what the teacher tells them to know about school. So a lot of working-class parents didn't know that their kids were 2 years below grade level because the teachers wanted to be positive and helpful. A lot of conflicts over homework in a lot of homes, especially middle-class homes. Okay. So the idea is there's a cultural logic of child rearing. Middle-class parents are more likely to comply with that than working-class parents. And that these are equally legitimate ways of raising children. It's perfectly reasonable to have a family life where you're based around seeing your kinfolk and hanging out and watching TV rather than having a lot of organized activities, versus having directives where kids are often much more polite to one another and to their parents rather than being demanding. But there are a difference in turning over responsibility to the school versus seeing yourself as having the right to criticize teachers. But middle-class kids get advantages from being in sync with the school more than do working-class kids and poor kids. So there's differential conformity with institutions. So it means that in many ways school districts are asking parents to fail. They're saying we want you to be involved in schooling, but they fail to see the different resources that kids bring to the circumstance. When the kids were 10 years older, the differences between them had increased. So the middle class kids were generally off to college, the working class kids were working. They had car payments, some of them had kids. So ironically, although it used to be that the middle class kids had seemed older and the working class kids had seemed younger, by the time they were 19 and 20, the pattern was reversed. The middle class kids were in college, they were still exploring things, they were thinking about traveling, they weren't thinking about getting married for another 10 years. The working class and poor kids were thinking about getting married in a couple years, some of them had kids. Many of them, they were all working, and they seemed older. They seemed more worn. And so the working class kids especially were working, and the poor kids from poor families were working. And these are pseudonyms, not the real names of colleges. And generally the middle class kids were in college, and if they weren't, many of their parents had a keen sense of failure that they weren't in college. This last slide looks at people who aspire to go to college in 10th grade. That's 10th grade bachelor degree aspirations. And it's organized by the educational level of the parent in the household. So the top line says that 86% of kids whose parents have a bachelor's degree or higher aspire to go to college, while about 2/3, 64% of kids whose a parent has some college, and just under half, 46% of people whose parents were high school graduates or dropouts. But then it turns out aspirations are only part of the picture. The next line is, are they prepared? Did they take the classes they need? It drops, 79, 53, 33. Did they take the SAT or ACT? 78, 49, 29. Did you ever apply to a four-year college? 73, 42, 25. And did you actually go to a four-year college? 65, 35, 21. Now, there may be other factors involved, but it's undeniable, I believe, that parent involvement plays a crucial role in shaping children's educational experiences. And yet, when we think of America and when we think of opportunities, we don't take seriously the role of parents. We look more at the individual. And so for educators, the policy implications are, there's not a school in the country where kids are allowed to clobber each other on the playground. But there are a lot of working class parents who believe that kids should defend themselves on the playground. So working class families and child-rearing strategies are more likely to clash with schools than middle class child-rearing strategies. And there's a need to think about that clash and the need. And often people are very creative in thinking of solutions once they acknowledge the problem. It's sort of a little bit like having a boyfriend or a girlfriend and not trying to change them, but trying to accept them for who they are and trying to meet them where they are rather than change them into some vision of how you think this person could ideally be, but rather than accepting the person as he or she is. And so Americans believe that people get ahead as a basis of hard work. And we know that from many cultural images of American dream, and we know that also from attitude studies. But this view is certainly partial and incomplete. And there's a need to look at the way that when people think about inequality, they think about racial inequality. But by looking at social class inequality, particularly in child rearing and organization of time, in language use, and in intervention of institutions, it gives us insight into the informal knowledge of how to apply for financial aid, how to make a claim on a grade, how to work for a job, course selection. And in doing so, it gives us a broader and richer picture of America. And my final thought is this is a very disturbing slide that was released just a couple weeks ago from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The top blue line is a recession in the 80s. This is each column is the number of months into the recession. The red line is a recession in the 90s. The green line is we're into 12 months into this recession. We've lost 3.5 million jobs, and the recession hasn't flattened out yet. We know that unemployment is bad for families. We know that it increases the likelihood of physical illness, of mental illness, of domestic violence. of tension between husbands and wives and divorce. And so as we head into these dire economic times, it's likely that the unemployment problems are going to hit some parts of the population harder than others, and they are concerns about our ability to respond to that as a country, but also in the implication for the kind of job prospects people have when already working class families are often starting this process with not as many resources as middle class families. And then here are some resources. There's a movie, People Like Us, Class in America, which I think is quite good. And then there's this New York Times series on Class Matters as other resources. So thank you very much.
Well, we have some time for questions, and we'll have we have this mic that we can use, and then Robbie, you'll have the mic as well. Robbie, maybe you can work that side, and I'll work this side with the mic. So if you have some questions, throw a hand up, and either Robbie or I will get to you with the microphone. In addition, I think you have evaluation forms that you received on the way in. Does that sound right? No?
Yeah.
Yes?
Orange.
Please fill those out if you have a chance, and then drop them off when you leave tonight. We really do appreciate your feedback.
And there's a question here.
What was that, Jean? Right. When we get done, I'll remind them of the reception.
There's
Questions?
food and a reception afterwards if you stay for questions.
Yes, thank you for your talk. As a retired educator, I felt a little bit attacked.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But I'm trying not to. I do appreciate the class issue, overtaking the race issue. I think that's important. I would recommend the AAUW study where the girls are, and it came up with the same kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't gender so much anymore, and the boys are not being attacked in this, but it is a class issue.
Right.
But now, I noticed 1988 on the bottom of one. Was most of the research done in 1988?
The research was done before 1988. The research was done in 93, 94. So it's a little bit old now.
Uh-huh.
There has been more recent research which is highly consistent with this research. I was really worried about the age. It took me a long time to write the book for various reasons. And I was really worried about it. Cell phones came out since that time. Internet really took off. But from what I understand, the general logic is very similar and consistent in these families, that has not changed very much.
Mm-hmm. I would agree with most of what you said, or probably virtually all of what you said about the middle class.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe it's just our community maybe isn't quite the same, because I didn't experience the same kinds of reactions. And I really, this hating of school and the jokes that go along with that part, I don't think is consistent necessarily by class.
There very well be. There's a huge Hmong population here, which is very different. I do think the thing is, though, that often it's hard for educators to know that.
Mm-hmm.
If there's not a trust of school, people often don't reveal that to educators. Though it depends. Maybe some people would.
And Ellen Goodman's column, either yesterday or today, is good and relates to what you're talking about, too, with the issues.
Thank you.
Would you find the class differences the same in a rural area as you would in a suburban or urban area?
Well, that's a good question. I began this study in the Midwestern community in a location that shall remain nameless. But it was a non-urban community. It was 25,000 people. And it was 2 hours from a major city. So it wasn't like a big city. And when you move to the big city, the kinds of activities people could do were a little bit different. There was more elaborate karate. There were more elaborate art lessons or music lessons. But the general logic of it was similar. If you got to rural areas, then it's different, because then people have to drive a long way, and people have farm chores and so forth. But in these sort of small towns, sort of like Wausau, I would expect that the dynamic would be similar among certain parts of the community. Yeah.
I noticed a lot of your research bulk the poor and the working class
Yes.
together.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about differences between those groups.
Yes, I should have mentioned that. There were important differences. There were food shortages in poor families, and there were not food shortages in working class families. Though one of the things about racial segregation in America is that white poor families live in more prosperous neighborhoods than do black poor families, because that's the benefit of racial segregation. There aren't like these huge housing projects for whites in the same way there are for blacks. And so I thought there would be a lot of differences between the poor and working class. And I was really stunned to find the difference seemed to be from the middle class on one hand and working class and poor on the other. But as the kids got older, I think those differences increased. Like in high school, Catholic schools are often about $3,000 a year, and the working class families were able to afford that in high school. And they were able to pay car insurance, they were able to help their kids go to school. So especially as kids were in the transition to adulthood, the differences between when poor families really couldn't, every dime really mattered, and kids really needed to get a job right away, working class families had more flexibility. And so I think it did matter as kids were older. But there were a lot of food shortages in poor families where people were running out of food at the end of the month before the food stamps came. And there's a lot of food scarcity in America. And that, I think, surprised me. And that didn't happen in working class families. There was food everywhere. Yeah? Yeah, why didn't I focus on the upper class? It would have been a great idea to study the upper class. I mean, partly you have to make hard choices. I mean, we were writing field notes 5 to 12 hours for every visit. And the study was already, I had this colleague who I liked very much who was named Hugh Meehan, who was in UC San Diego. And I said, how many families would you study? He said, about 2, maybe 1, you know. It was completely insane to study 12 families. And then there are issues in terms of access to the upper class. It can be hard. I am hoping in my next study to study the upper class, especially people who are born rich, which there's a great movie called Born Rich, which I think is really good, about people who don't have to work because they have enough money from stock that they don't have to work. And I'd like to include them in my next study. Yeah?
With the economic hardships right now, do you predict there will be a slide in the economic classes, or are the classes going to stay together and just go up and down with the economy?
You mean slide that people will...
That they'll change classes, or are the classes going to move together?
Well, see, I mean, sociologists spend a lot of time arguing about how to define social class. And income, it turns out, fluctuates a lot up each year and up. And like I have a nephew who's a Jehovah's Witness who didn't go to college. And his income was something like $80,000 when he came out of high school unexpectedly. But then his ability to get a different job was extremely limited because his income was connected to that company. Well, if he had a college degree, he would have greater mobility. So to me, the big issue is the college degree. We have known since about the mid-1980s the income inequality has increased. And the difference between the benefit of a college degree, the gap between a college degree salary and a high school grad salary used to be not very big. But it has grown significantly over time, as has the gap from the rich and the poor. So we might see some shrinking of income inequality, like with the CEO, you know, that the salaries might be truncated for the top elite. I think we are going to see, you know, loss of high quality jobs. The problem is America's making a lot of jobs, but the jobs aren't very high quality. So we've had the restructuring of the economy. We have a lot of part-time jobs, a lot of temporary jobs, a lot of jobs at Walmart. We don't have high-paying jobs that pay benefits. So as the number of high quality, high-level professional jobs shrink, then the number of people in the upper middle class probably could shrink as well.
I have a question right
along with raising the awareness and sensitivity of educators regarding this, what else can be done as far as
Well,
alleviating these
yeah.
differences?
I mean, it's hard. Sometimes I feel like I don't have enough to say about policy, but it reminds me of this book by Deborah Tannen called You Just Don't Understand, which is about communication in marriage and about how women talk more than men and, et cetera, et cetera. And she said that that once she identified the problem, she found couples were very creative in trying to find solutions. And there are a lot of people, I think, in this country who would have lots of good ideas about what to do. But I think the key problem is often this issue is invisible. I think clearly the Western European model of the Sweden, Germany, France with child supports, so that people get a check for every child you have, so you don't have child in poverty, I think would be extremely helpful. Having a standardized educational system where there's not such huge disparities in the quality of the public schools, I think would be extremely helpful. It used to be most Americans went to public school, and now the number of people, like in where I live, a whopping 30% of people are in private schools. So as the public schools have been seen to deteriorate, more and more people are leaving them. And I think if it was mandatory that upper middle class people had to send their kids to public schools, I think the public schools would probably improve. And so I think universal programs, I think, are a useful policy. Like Social Security is not stigmatized, while poverty programs are. So even though you're giving government programs to people who could afford otherwise, I think in order to have sufficient legitimacy, it's better to make programs universal for everybody.
I was just wondering, when you chose your subjects, when you defined the middle class,
Yeah.
were those parents, were their parents middle class? Had they
Right.
been generations of
Right.
being middle class, or had they moved like several of us? My parents were working
Right.
class, and I looked at how I raised my children as a middle class mom
Right.
versus how I was raised, and I was wondering if you had
Yeah.
that clarity in your subjects.
We did ask everybody, all 88 families, we asked them what their parents had done and what their grandparents had done in terms of jobs and education. And we did have quite a few families who were upwardly mobile. One of my favorite families was this African American dad who was a lawyer whose wife had tragically died unexpectedly 18 months before. And he was just, his father was a blue collar guy, and his father just could not believe that he was trying to reason with the 2-year-old. He just could not believe it. And every time he was over there, the grandparents were like, come on, just like go, solve that problem, And the parents were reasoning and trying to tell him, no, we don't do this for this reason, la da. And it could create a fair amount of family tension with the grandparents and the parents. And I think it is, for those of us who teach in colleges or people who go to colleges, there's a book called Passing the Torch, which is about the city university system, open admission system in New York City, and also looked at national data. And there is something transformative about a college degree. And it looks like people who have a college degree are different on the other side of having a degree than they were without that experience. And it really changes child rearing. It changes, parents are much more likely to read to kids, they're much more likely to reason with kids, they're much more likely to attend school events, and so there's something very powerful about a college education. And so it's not so much how you were raised, I think, as your own educational trajectory that's crucial, especially for mothers.
You showed when you went back to the kids on working families, how many of them did you find that actually went to college and got a college degree?
Among the working class and poor families, almost a couple of kids started college. One kid who was a biracial kid, who was kind of a very unusual kid. The reason why I picked her was that she was the highest achieving kid in the 4th grade in the public school. Her mom was white and her dad was black. And her mom actually had a college degree but was working as a babysitter, and his dad had kind of a technical job. She was very interesting. She had very high SAT scores. And she could have gone to a lot of colleges. But her parents didn't really, she said, oh, she has a shelf. She was like a national merit semifinalist, so all these information about colleges were pouring in. But they left it up to her to figure out what college to go to. She was offered a scholarship at one college, she went to that college. She really wanted to go to a private college, and probably she could have gone there for a financial aid package, but she didn't know that private schools offer handsome financial aid packages if you have need. All she saw was the tuition was 20-something thousand, and she thought it was out. I had another kid who had a combined SAT score of 689, she was a public school kid, which is a pretty common SAT score if you are in cities. I don't know what a comparable ACT score would be. Do you know? Does anyone know? Like a very low, like 8 probably or something. I don't know. It's the bottom quartile percentile. I mean, you get basically 600 points for showing up and signing your name. And she could have gotten a total of 1,200. And she applied to 7 colleges, but she applied to colleges where the average SAT score was like 1,200 or 1,300. You know, so if she had been my daughter, probably I could have gotten her into college, but she would have had to know where to apply. She needed more informal knowledge. And then somebody else started college and quit after a semester. So and then some people got there and they were mad because they had to take remedial courses. So kids started college, but nobody finished, except for this one kid. Nobody, of the 8 kids, nobody finished college.
Okay, I have a quick question. The assumption of this is a sense of entitlement, the assertiveness would give you a competitive advantage
Right.
In American society.
Right.
I wonder if this kind of skill would be beneficial for minority groups, because you can acquire this sense of entitlement, but would that be perceived work against you in the real world? And that's my question, I guess. I'm just curious.
Well, that's a really good question. I'm often asked, what about Asian exceptionalism? Asian kids whose parents are immigrants, and yet these kids are very high achieving. And I mean, I don't think I have a wonderful answer to it, but my answer is, if in America, if you were going to be born rich, the best way to be born, if you want to be rich, the best way to be rich is to be born rich. Like among the top, 20 people in America, most of them are Walmart heirs and Bill Gates, things like that. But there are people who become rich in America. It's not as common a path, but they can't do this. So, I mean, sometimes you do see teachers have cultural stereotypes towards Asians, like they'll put them in higher classes, or some studies have shown that. Or they'll say, oh, I know her parents really value education, so they'll do this or that. So sometimes there would be stereotypes in terms of schooling. But your question is something different. Your question is, could have... Right. 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 Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. There was something I was reading somewhere that said that especially for young black men to be assertive could be very problematic. And a lot of the very successful African American, I mean, there's a lot of racial discrimination in America, particularly in hiring. There's some really important studies coming out where they're sending out people called audit studies. They send out 2 people who look very much alike, who they hire and they train, same age, same body type, same clothing, same resume. They send them out to apply for the same jobs, like within the same day. And now most people don't get callbacks. This is Diva Pager at Princeton. But whites who report themselves to be convicted felons get a higher callback rate than do African Americans with no criminal record. So there's no doubt in my mind that there's racial discrimination in hiring. So I think there are some spheres where there's persistent racial discrimination. And so could the sense of entitlement backfire if people are not complying with cultural expectations? Yeah, it probably could. I think it's an interesting concept, yeah.
Why do you base the classes on education, not on income?
Well, it's a good question. People's income comes and goes, and people could have, athletes have very high income. But the income is a temporary feature. And if you get laid off, your prior income does not predict your future income. What's one of the best predictors of your future income is your education. and your occupational experience. Now, other people disagree. Other people base it on income. But to me, it's important to me what kinds of jobs people are eligible to get. And a college degree increasingly is crucial in sorting people into jobs. And also the prestige of the occupation matters a lot to me. So there's something called hidden injuries of class, and people who make plumbers, who make much more money than elementary school teachers, still don't have the same sense of respect and dignity that elementary school teachers have, who have a higher level of respect. So I think education is crucial in stratifying people.
How does this all translate into the workplace, into the corporate
Right.
settings?
Well, there are some people who think that there are many corporate settings, particularly managerial settings, where people's informal knowledge of cultural skills is very important in shaping promotional opportunities. So there are many jobs, for example, that knowing how to play golf is very helpful in terms of occupational promotions. Other people think, especially in business, it turns out in business it's hard to, for example, increase market share. Let's say you were building Pringles potato chip and you were part of Procter & Gamble. How do you evaluate if you've increased market share and if you've really done a good job? And like if you have a working class job, like you roll down a window, roll up a window, or you put labels on things, or you deliver things, it's very clear how to evaluate people. And in middle class jobs where there's a lot of complexity of the jobs, people often evaluate people on social homogeneity, in the degree to which you get along with people and you're part of the team and you can relate to people and you connect to people. So there's some indication that cultural resources, jokes about movies, leisure activities, knowledge of food and wine could potentially be influential in the workplace.
I'm an elementary educator, and I see a trend that first grade material is being put into kindergarten.
Right.
And there's less emphasis on language.
Yeah.
How do you see that playing into class structure?
Well, there's a lot of, because of No Child Left Behind and all this sort of frenzy about testing, and I think there has been a speed up of education. I think what that would do is it would provide an advantage to middle class kids who get more language development and language reinforcement at home versus kids who are dependent upon the school. Like they do these studies of summer progress, a summer setback. And it turns out that kids learn at relatively similar rates through the school year. But then in the summer, middle class kids keep learning and working class and poor kids stop learning. So then the gap widens, and then they get back in the fall, and they start again. So over the summer, middle class kids keep advancing, and working class and poor kids don't keep advancing. And so that leads to a growing gap. So I would think that if there's been a less of a development on reading, language development, that it would benefit kids who are getting reading and language development at home.
We have time for one more question.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
I have a question for you. When you had visited the children that were in your study,
Yes.
or 10 years later,
Yeah.
targeting the poor families in the working class, had any of the children told you that they had wished that their parents had pushed them harder, or that your parents could have done something to enrich their lives more?
Well, that's a good question. When I started this study, maybe naively, I thought that the families were going to be comparing themselves to one another. But it turned out that, for the most part, was not the case. So the Tallengers compared themselves to a family that had wood paneling in the living room and the dining room and could afford to go on ski vacations, and who they felt, Mrs. Tallenger they had a swimming pool and an extremely fancy house, but they felt that their house was not up to snuff of their friends, and they didn't feel like they could reciprocate for dinner. They didn't even know that there were people 20 minutes away who didn't have enough food, and they didn't even think about them. And similarly, in the housing projects in the working class homes, people like the McAllister mom compared herself to a mom who was on dope and wasn't taking care of her kids. And the working class parents compare themselves to, they had a washer and dryer, they could pay their bills, one of them had a credit card. So people tended to compare themselves against relatively short social distances and seemed either unaware or just on TV, or just it wasn't part of their social world to see other people. One of the working class kids did wish that he'd been raised in the suburbs, as he said it. He thought that he would have gone to college and he would have been more prosperous. But it wasn't that he blamed his parents as much as he just sort of wished he'd been raised in the suburbs. But what we do know about America, there's a book called Ain't No Making It, which is excellent about multicultural education, about blacks and whites. It's really good. And in general, Americans take responsibility for their class position. So no matter how difficult it is to be upwardly mobile and how rare it is to go from rags to riches, most people say at the end of their lives that I didn't work hard enough. I goofed up in high school. I should have studied harder. And so the schools legitimate the sorting process. The biggest predictor of an SAT score, one of the biggest predictors is a parent's education. And so clearly, parents' social class position is influencing educational process and educational outcomes, but yet people think of it as being their own responsibility and their own talent and merit. And so in that way, that's the way we say schools help to reproduce inequalities, although there is significant upward and downward mobilities. At the end of the day, people own their own position as being the result of their effort, which is a uniquely American point of view.
Great, wonderful questions. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Lareau, for
Thank you.
engaging and insightful talk. Let me remind you of the evaluation forms to drop off on your way out, and let me say thanks to Chris Berg for his technical assistance, Robbie for staffing the mic, I'd like to invite all of you to the terrace room for cookies and punch, and Yankee Books will be there selling Dr. Lareau's book as well. And thank you for coming out tonight.